That was an excerpt of Ikimaruka, which is an invitation. It's a call, in a sense. It's part of a perpetual project I have, long running series of conversations rather than performances, as this is not entertainment. The idea is that it's referencing a large body of independent research that I've engaged in reclaiming a series of recordings from the Rwandan Royal Court from the 1950s from a group of ethnomusicologists who took recordings of the Rwandan groups performing there and brought them into a library in Belgium, but have never returned those recordings or reconnected the Rwandan people to those sounds of their ancestors. So this is part of my project in doing so, in reappropriating, as I like to say. And a note on what I'm wearing as well. This says reappropriate. It is an artwork that was hung in a gallery as part of an exhibition from Susan Forrester, who's a Somali Australian artist, Susan Mako Forrester. And her discussion here is being a third culture kid herself, having a hybrid sense of identity and hybrid heritage, growing up in a different space, but seeing your image and your culture appropriated in lots of different ways. And that's something that we will definitely get to. I'm Stéphanie Kabanyana Kanyandakwe. This is my collaborator, Ben Opie, who you heard there. Ben, what were you playing?
So the instrument that I was playing was the oboe. That's my Western classical instrument. Um, just a little intro about me. I studied the oboe from quite a young age, from around about 13 years old, and did all of the usual things that one would do in terms of becoming a classical musician, and then took a sharp steer in a slightly different direction. I still play a lot of classical music. There's no question about that. But my eye has been turned towards reaching out to different communities and using music to help them express themselves, help me express myself, communicate more widely. And so that has been in the form of working in aged care centres, as well as working with kids who are blind or have visual impairment, also kids who are deaf or who are hard of hearing. I've worked with people in the Melbourne immigration detention centres, and even a couple of years ago flew all the way over to Turkey to work with children who were Syrian refugees who'd gone across the border to be in Turkey. I think in all of this work, it's something that Stephanie and I talk a lot about, actually, about what our responsibility is as creative artists. And I guess something that came up out of the discussion about this conference was, who are we, and I guess almost what do we, is there a label for us that we can look at as people who have been heavily trained in an extreme way through institutions, and have come to this point of constantly asking ourselves different questions around who we are and what our responsibility is in this industry. And I guess what we've come to is that we feel like, more than anything, we are these transistors, this kind of someone who is able to make change or shift things along the way. And the other question that we've been asking ourselves lately is what it means to be a cultural accomplice. So we'll get to that a little bit later, but Stephanie, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thanks, Ben. I'm a multidisciplinary artist. I have Rwandese British heritage, and as a third culture kid, as someone who has this hybrid identity and has been raised in multiple other cultures around the world before finally settling in Australia, I use a lot of that lens through my work, predominantly as a composer, but I don't treat that as just an audio thing. I don't write, dots on a page for a group of musicians to put on their concert blacks and sit on a stage and play you. My work is always participatory. So it's a bit odd that we're coming to you in this way. COVID does funny things to our plans, doesn't it? If we were there with you in person, we'd totally be playing these works and having this conversation and getting you to be a part of it. That's part of my arts practice that is research based. So I spend a lot of time living and diving through archives across the globe, looking at predominantly Rwandese content and finding ways to share that knowledge and information that's locked up in various libraries and museum collections with a contemporary Rwandese and global audience, to ensure that our cultural heritage is maintained, but also a little bit better understood, because largely a lot of the content that I'm working with is through the interpretation and through the lens of ethnographers and ethnomusicologists who have their particular ways at looking at things. And that's something that I think we'll get to a bit as well. Ben, what is this music that we're playing today? Well, how would you describe it?
I think almost all of the music that you and I work on together, I think you might have mentioned it at the beginning, it's a conversation, it's a discussion, it's a reflection. In this case, the invitation was given to me to reflect and be inspired by this piece of music, the drums. And so I did that in a few different ways. There's a conceptual element to it, but also some technical things as well, of responding to the rhythms that are in there. And I think more broadly, this idea that the piece is a calling together, a call to gather, is important as well, because it's what we're doing today, regardless of whether we're in the same room or not. Did you feel the same way about that?
Yeah, this is why I choose these types of sounds, and I choose to reference these elements of my history, because in the case of Ikimanuka, this particular drum track, recorded in I think 55, something like that, by a Belgian ethnographer, ethnomusicologist, was in a gathering around the king's premises. And so it's a gathering and a call for people to come and listen to some really important information. And though, while I'm not saying we're kings and queens here, in another way, I'm trying to bring across the importance of the information that we have to give people, that I realize is very unique. There aren't many people, particularly in our industry, that are having the conversations that we have, and that are, really breaking down these barriers around how we can have solidarity in diversity within our own, art music world. And I guess on that, to give you a better definition of what we consider art music, there are 4 tenets to music in any culture. That is sacred, so your religious stuff; the secular, so your common wedding dances and whatever; your folk, music for enjoyment but it's not particularly highbrow; and your art. And that is music with important information and with a deeper concern or regard to it. What we've studied is art music from a Western lens, and we both use that study and those techniques to flex in completely different ways. Hence, transistors of change, in that electrical sense, if you will, taking a body of energy and either amplifying it, taking this body of knowledge and pushing out particular elements of it, or being a code switch, which is the other part of being a transistor. And that is understanding that a lot of the stuff that we've learned is highly problematic. But what we can do with that is recontextualize and reframe, and also, I would say, re-indigenize, reinsert different bodies of information that were dropped out of the classical canon, in a sense. I mean, yeah. Ben, we're trained to be experts and considered experts at exceptionally young ages. I mean, how many hours do they say it takes? Something like...
They say 10,000, but then, we all know it's more than that. And it does start from that early age. And I think it is an important, again, it comes back to responsibility, and not just responsibility for people in the classical music industry or people starting out in the classical music industry. but it's something that all of us need to reflect on all the time with all the projects that we do. It's probably a good chance for us to go to our next music excerpt, which, yeah, and again, this was a project that you and I worked together on about 3 years ago, and yeah, I guess that idea of responsibility and that idea of care and transisting change again, that was all part of this project that we worked on together. Do you want to talk a bit more about this is a piece that Stephanie composed, so I'll let her speak about it.
So as transistors of change in this particular instance, we're acknowledging that we're always deliverers of something. So the who, the how, and the what is Brooke Andrew, an Indigenous artist from Australia, from here, from Western New South Wales, a Wiradjuri and Celtic heritage man, commissioned me as a descendant of those who experienced a genocide to write a piece of music for all of those who have been lost through genocides at the hands of colonial forces or part of colonial forces. This is an impossible task and this is something that no one can achieve. But the very premise and the question of it is how this work comes about. It uses a cranium, the image of a skull in the score, which is a painted score. And why I chose to do that is a part of connecting the musicians at all times to elements that are within this actual exhibition and this body of work. And I say body literally, as in the heart, in the center of the exhibition is a glass vitrine that holds a human skeleton in it. One of many skeletons that was stolen from the Indigenous peoples of Tasmania and brought into a collection at the University of Melbourne and studied to see the intelligence of people through using archaic forms of science that is now largely seen, quite rightfully so, as racist and completely crazy. So this skull sits at the heart of the Vox, and so my piece of music has the skull in it so that musicians at all times are having that engagement with what they're there to do, and that is to participate in a conversation around acknowledging that we are on unceded lands and sovereignty, was never ceded here. And we are yet to have a treaty with this group of peoples. So how do we promote and develop and have solidarity with diversity when we still don't acknowledge the different ways that we have been purposely divided and not able to be, solid and have that solidarity between us, and also not able to acknowledge the positivity in diversity. Often it's been quite negative. So here's this excerpt from Illusions on Self-Motion. So that was an excerpt of Illusions on Self Motion, again, a perpetual project, a work where at all times the iterations are not seen as performances. They're not things for you to sit there and absorb as a passive audience member and applaud and then walk away and say, oh, wasn't that nice? Where should we go for dinner? No, no, no. That is not the vibe here. This is very much about engaging your brains and bringing to light a certain body of information in an artistic way, in a different way to receiving it that stands out, I guess, from just going into a museum and reading a wall didactic. So you heard Ben there and myself both being a part of that presentation and that conversation. And as you should know as well, that was not presented without having a discussion like we've just done in the presentation of information to make sure that I identify and acknowledge my position here as someone who is a non-Indigenous person, non-Indigenous to this land at least, who was invited to be a part of this process and who gained the appropriate permissions to use cultural elements, including a skull image from the Indigenous peoples of Tasmania via the commissioning artist Brooke Andrew in order to present this work, and have gained the permissions to continue to present this work working with different collaborators as long as we always identify and have this conversation. So it really kind of blows out, Ben, this idea of art music as performance and entertainment. And I think this is where some people feel really challenged at times. As a transistor of change, or better yet, how do you see yourself as a transistor of change given the industry that we're connected by?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons we started talking in this language, with this language, around the idea of a transistor of change, or being a transistor in our industry, is partly because we couldn't quite find a way to talk about this concept of maybe having a voice, or there being a voice where a conversation is being had about us or for us, but not by us. And I remember several years ago having a bit of a moment where, perhaps because of a lot of significant resistance to my participation in that conversation, I thought I'm not sure that I want to have that voice by me. I'm not sure that that's the right path forward for me as being in that part of the conversation. And so bit by bit, and again, this was an evolution over many years of trying to work out how can I still be part of the conversation without necessarily using my spoken voice, and with using the things that I've spent 10,000 hours training on to hone and craft. Where that's ended me up is, like I mentioned earlier, in this realm of working with different marginalized communities and using music in such a way that is meaningful and has an absolute connection, kind of by the nature of it, because it does, and it is, and the way that I play on my instrument, like you say, it's not necessarily for the purpose of entertainment. That being said, there ain't nothing wrong with a nice tune every now and then, because I think that's part of what we do as well. That kind of, particularly, going into aged care and performing familiar works, again with a real sense of context and thoughtfulness in the programs that we present, is an important part of being a transistor again, because that's a way that we can connect and then maybe connect and introduce into something new and exciting for that person. Because once they're I guess this is what a transistor does, is build trust. Once you, as a transistor, once you've done it enough times, once you've had a flow of knowledge, or you've changed a path of creativity, people begin to trust you, and you can start to introduce them to new things. So I think that's how I do it. And I mean, you, Stephanie, have been part of quite a few of these different iterations, in particular working with some of the children who are blind or have low vision. And it's, I think it's the best way to communicate is through these sorts of, yeah, these sorts of workshops and these kinds of connections with experience. Where we can share our part in the discussion without necessarily saying it with words. And yet here we
Mm.
are.
And here we are, lots of words
Lots of
about
words.
music.
How about you? What's in your experience with this being a transistor of change?
Well, as a transistor in this body and born into the cultural heritages that I have, I see my role as highlighting a lot of missed information that's deleted out of the canon, willingly deleted out of the canon of art musics globally, not just in the West, but globally, and focusing on the musics of female makers and of Indigenous peoples globally in creating their own art music sound. You just have to look at somewhere like India, for example, that has over 8 distinct types of art music schools that go through a few thousand years to understand that everybody has this art music, but why is it one culture that just gets to own a sense of having higher order thinking or research informed music as part of their culture? And for me, it really comes down to some pretty ugly sentences, and that is that unfortunately, classical music, so-called classical music, gets to hold a title in a way of being the last bastion of colonization. In what other industry do you sit around celebrating what you did 300 years ago and
And that it
continuing
wasn't a good thing.
and that it wasn't a good thing, and continuing to say that we are so superior because look at this, we have the Bach and the Mozart and all the dudes, all the dead white dudes. But what about all the women who are around them? And what about all of the indigenous groups who are around them and the people like Debussy who suddenly stole a whole body of music from gamelan players who rocked up at the World Exhibition Fair? And Debussy is credited with, coming into this impressionistic style when actually he just tottered down to this little fair pagoda, heard some stuff and went, oh, I'll have that because that's what we do. So I see myself as a transistor in kind of moving back and pushing back against some of that information, recontextualizing it, reframing that, reinserting, re-indigenizing a lot of the canon, and also just making people aware of the language that they use. So we can't have solidarity and diversity. It is an impossibility if we do not celebrate that diversity and make sure that we're not getting to be diverse, innovative, and all of those things by stamping on and stepping on others and appropriating their stuff. Reappropriation is a deal.
It's interesting too, because exactly what you're talking about actually brings us to the other thing that we wanted to talk about, which is being a cultural accomplice. And exactly what you're talking about, using our position as transistors of change, that puts us in this immediate place of being a cultural accomplice. Now, I love this term, but it's one that you introduced me to. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
So, the idea of allyship can die. It needs to stop. Stop it. As soon as you start saying the words, well, I'm an... No, you're not. Here's the thing. Allyship is just a lot of this, but it doesn't at any time, in its very definition, no skin in the game, as I like to say, which is why I make people participate in my work, because I don't want you to sit there and go, oh, look at the black woman on stage, isn't that, oh, I'm an ally, I'm supporting the black, like, no, you're not. No, you're going to sit there and you're going to participate because I need you to be an accomplice. I need us to be in it together. An accomplice is a ride or die in the truest sense of African American Vernacular English, or AAVE, to use that set of language. An accomplice is someone who is willing to stick their neck out for you when they have a lot to lose, like you. And they're there to say, you know, I'm going to use whatever privileges, whatever power I have to flex it in support. And so being a cultural accomplice is far more important than being any form of ally, because only through accomplices and through the actions of accomplices can we get some level of solidarity. For me, that is the truest sense of solidarity. I'm going to be with you because I'm standing right there beside you, and I'm pushing everything I can, even when it's not sexy, it's not Instagrammable, it's in front of lots of boardroom meetings and having very difficult conversations with belligerent people and institutions, etc. That's what accompliship is, you know. And even when it doesn't benefit you at all, particularly when it doesn't benefit you at all, that's the idea that we bring to this table now, and say, I implore all of you to consider yourselves transistors of change and join us in being cultural accomplices.
Absolutely. And I wonder if this idea of solidarity and diversity as well, it's part of it too. You know, like you mentioned before, that idea of being a cultural accomplice often means that you put yourself in a vulnerable position. The people that we're working with are already usually in that marginalized group, that marginalized community, and they're the ones who are already vulnerable. But together, that solidarity in diversity will make us all cultural accomplices.
Mm. So on that note, we want to thank you for being here with us, and through participating, through your attention, through your comprehension, and then I hope through your own action too, in your various groups, associations and institutions. And so we want to end with giving you what we do best, and that is some more music, again referencing that Ikimanuka, but with a little bit of a twist this time round, to see out the conference.